Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just letting people in and we will be starting in 1 minute. And in the meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and then perhaps where you're joining from in the world. And then we'll get started very shortly.
please put into window. Can you just check this?
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here again. You're welcome to continue introducing yourself in the chat. My name is Erin Navarro. I will be one of your presenters today. I am the Senior Coordinator of Learning and Resources here at Volunteer Alberta. And I'm very excited for the start of this webinar series, starting with volunteer rights, what volunteers and board members need to know. So this is a recorded session. We will stop the recording before the question and answer time at the very end after we've gone through all the slides. And before the question and answer time, we do ask that you remain on mute. But any questions you do have, you can type into the chat. My colleague and I, Michael, will be able to answer as many questions as we can while you type them into the chat, and then we'll have a general question and answer time at the end as well. So again, we thank you for remaining on mute. And with that, we will get started with our land affirmation, as is our practice here at Volunteer Alberta. So Volunteer Alberta's main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, specifically Amiskwaciwâskagen, as it is referred to by the Plains Cree peoples, among other Indigenous names, and the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So our staff, our board, and our work reach across treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, and we affirm that the land we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory, as well as the present-day homes of many nations, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta, which includes the Métis settlements in the 21 districts of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So since time immemorial, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have cared for these lands, and they continue to do so today. And Volunteer Alberta identifies and affirms the historical as well as the current relationships of these nations to the land as an act of reconciliation, and with the awareness that acknowledging, recognizing, or affirming these facts is a small step and it is not enough. So Volunteer Alberta is committed to continuous reflection on critique and changing our ways of knowing, being, and doing in order to start supporting and concretely contributing to reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence in ways that we have not yet done. So within the context of volunteer rights and responsibilities today, we all as treaty people have a responsibility to the land and all of its inhabitants. And as you contribute to your communities through volunteering and civic engagement, let us collectively move towards reconciliation in all realms of our lives. So on the next slide, I'm just going to quickly go through what the volunteer screening program is, which is, or otherwise known as VSP, which is a program here at Volunteer Alberta, and the program that we are presenting the webinar today through. So the volunteer screening program is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the government of Alberta. We provide educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofit voluntary sector organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. And we also offer financial opportunities to aid organizations in their volunteer screening efforts, which includes the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver, which some of you may be familiar with, and the Volunteer Screening Development Grants, which will be open again later in the summer. So when we say volunteer screening or screening, I'm very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and organizations. Screening is a very big topic, which encompasses a lot of subtopics, such as what we're covering today, but all of these collectively aim to improve the quality and the safety of programs and services in our communities. So please note as well that Volunteer Alberta branded content, all the Volunteer Alberta branded content, a part of this webinar is meant to provide some useful general information, which does not substitute for legal advice. But of course, IntegralOrg will be providing information on the legal topics we will be covering today. So with that, I'd like to present our speaker today, Yvonne Chenier. Yvonne is a co-founder of IntegralOrg, and Yvonne brings more than 35 years of experience helping those in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and social enterprise sectors as general legal counsel and as an advisor on planning, organizational, regulatory, and governance matters. So Yvonne speaks frequently on behalf of IntegralOrg to various groups on many legal topics. And Yvonne is an active member of the executive of the Charities and Nonprofit section of the Canadian Bar Association, and is past chair of both the Alberta and national sections. And she is named the Canadian Legal Expert Directory for Excellence in Charity Law and has been selected by her peers for inclusion in the best lawyers in Canada for her work in charities and nonprofit law. So thank you, Yvonne, for being here. We are very much looking forward to hearing more from you and your wisdom and knowledge and expertise on this topic. And with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Erin. And it's a pleasure to be here and speak on something as important to the sector as volunteer rights. And IntegralOrg is a registered charity, and we are a capacity builder for nonprofit organizations and charities in Alberta. We do a lot of things, including seminars like this, workshops where we talk about many things, including items that relate to governance, board development, strategic planning, risk management, and of course, we do have legal support through our free clinics and various other projects we do. We are an approved legal service provider for the Law Society of Alberta. So with that, I'll start about our overview today. What are we going to talk about? The topic was volunteer rights in Alberta. So we're going to just talk briefly, as you all know probably, what is volunteering, first of all, and then do volunteers have rights? And if so, where do these rights come from? And volunteer directors are a separate class of volunteers, so we'll touch briefly on some of their duties and the rights they have. And a common question often in these kinds of seminars is indemnities and insurance. What's up with that? And developing a scope of services and duties of volunteers is an important topic, and Erin will certainly cover that. So without further ado, I'll go into my first slide here about what is volunteering. And there's lots of definitions, and I think if you are a volunteer, you know what you are. But according to the International Labor Organization, which is an interesting place to look for a definition of volunteer, volunteering covers a wide range of activities, including traditional forms of mutual aid and self-help, formal service delivery, and other forms of civic participation undertaken of free will for the general public good and where monetary reward is not the principal motivating factor. So in other words, if you look at that, we all know that volunteering is doing something for others willingly without being paid to do it. So that's what we're dealing with today. People who are doing free things for others out of the goodness of their heart. So do these people have rights? Let's go on to our topic. Do they have rights? And if so, where do volunteer rights come from? Well, we're in Canada, and in Canada, rights generally for Canadians come from the Constitution and other laws, where legal rights and human rights and democratic rights and equality rights are all spelled out. However, it's important to know, and these are sort of general legal concepts, that rights are given or granted to certain people. And that's what all those other legislation documents that I was referring to, they grant rights to someone. Well, volunteer rights in Alberta also need to be granted. You're not born with volunteer rights. In Alberta, I see three basic places where volunteer rights are granted. One, there are laws created by our legislation in Alberta. Two, a volunteer contract between the volunteer and the organization. That could also grant specific rights to a volunteer. And finally, rights given to volunteers could be in an organization's policy. And those are the things I'll talk briefly about. But generally, you know, the theme here is that if you want to look for rights, you have to look for a place where those rights have been given or granted to you. So let's go to the examples of some legislation in Alberta. And we're just talking about legislation in Alberta here right now because we are in Alberta, and volunteer rights in Alberta have a special place because we do have an act called the Freedom to Care Act. That's one of the places where I found volunteer rights in our legislation. And the other legislation that's important in nonprofit and charity organizations is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And it also provides certain rights that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the Freedom to Care Act. This is a unique statute really in Canada. There's only maybe one or two other jurisdictions that have something similar. But our Freedom to Care Act in Alberta was created in 2021, enacted in 2021, to provide volunteer liability protection for directors, officers, or trustee positions in certain incorporated nonprofit organizations. So that probably covers most of your organizations here if you've been incorporated under legislation in the province of Alberta. So a volunteer has a right to be protected under this act. So what is protected? Well, the act is intended to provide protection from liability for volunteers and remove barriers. So it's there to encourage people to volunteer without worrying about their personal liability for the actions that will happen when they're doing their volunteer job. So it does provide broad liability protection, but it does talk about individual volunteers that are acting within the scope of their duties on behalf of an organization. So that is a key phrase to think about when you're worrying about, am I protected as a volunteer under this legislation? You have to say, am I an individual volunteer? Am I acting within the scope of my duties for this specific organization? And the definition of volunteer that they use in this legislation, it defines a volunteer as including a director, officer, or trustee of a nonprofit organization who's not compensated for their role. So basically it fits right in with our definition of volunteers. So there's a little special thing on this about professionals, and that's the next slide, because many of your organizations I know have volunteers acting in their professional capacity for your organization. So they need to specifically have a look at this legislation. I'm not going to go into it, but generally it does protect the professional designation volunteers if they are properly licensed, certified, or authorized while they're doing their volunteer job. So if you have professional liability questions and you are a volunteer, please review that act carefully. So the next slide that we can go to, Liz, thank you. What's not protected? This is key because you have rights, you are protected as a volunteer, but there are certain things that you might be doing as a volunteer where you're not protected. And I think these are common sense things and apply to many other areas of our laws and our lives. Of course, if you're not going to be protected as a volunteer if you've been willful, reckless, or you've done any criminal misconduct. Or you've been grossly negligent. These are all legal terms that are well understood in our laws. And an important one, if the damage that you cause as a volunteer was caused while you were operating a motor vehicle or other kind of craft, for which the owner is required by law to maintain insurance. So in Alberta, we're required to maintain insurance. So if you're operating your own vehicle and something goes wrong, you may not receive the protection under this act. Why? Because you have vehicle insurance. If you are creating an offense while you're causing the damage, and if you are impaired by alcohol or drugs. So these are common sense things, except for the motor vehicle one, which I think you need to really focus on if you're an organization or a volunteer. So this act, though, this is important, it does not affect the liability of any nonprofit organization itself. So remember, it's protecting the volunteers when they do something that causes damage from being liable for that. It doesn't protect the nonprofit organization, meaning the nonprofit organization is responsible for the acts of its volunteers. So the act goes specifically to say that the organization also has no right of recovery against the volunteer if the volunteer is not liable. So this is key. The concept here is volunteers are protected if they're acting in the scope of their duties for an organization, unless they were doing one of these other things that's not protected, but the organization is still responsible and it still has to worry about the liability for the acts of its volunteers. And if something happens, there's no right of recovery against a volunteer that has been afforded the protection under this act. Boy, that's a long-winded version of the Freedom to Care Act in Alberta. Important act, please look at it. The next statute that I referred to in Alberta that has some rights for volunteers is our Occupational and Health and Safety Act. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the definitions that are key to volunteers here. Basic rights of workers, special talk about harassment and violence, and give you some resources for further information about this important act. So we have a quiz. So we're going to give you some questions before I start talking about occupational health and safety. So answer the following questions, true or false, and then submit, and we'll see how much you know about this. So the first question is, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and we're talking about Alberta here, the definition of worker does not include volunteers. Is that true or false? And then under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, harassment and violence are considered workplace hazards. Is that true or false? What do you think? Should we end it? I think so. Let's quickly, 1, 2, 3, 4, end the poll. Good. And the results are in. So most of you got the answers right, because of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Occupational Health and Safety Act very quickly, about the fact that it does include volunteers, and the harassment and violence are considered workplace hazards, of course, that apply to volunteers. So let's talk about the next slide. I'm trying to stop the quiz here. There we go. So the definitions, there they are, the definitions for you. Employer includes a charity or a nonprofit organization under our OHS Act. A worker does include a volunteer. And a work site means a location basically where a worker, and think volunteer, is engaged in their occupation, and it includes any vehicle or mobile equipment used by them. So basically, think about all your volunteers, or think about what you do as volunteering for an organization, and you probably see yourself as covered under this legislation. The next basic definition that is important in this act is that it gives workers, i.e. volunteers, basic rights. And what are your basic rights? Well, there are 3. You can refuse to do dangerous work. So you have the right to refuse dangerous work as a volunteer, saying, I'm not going to get involved in that, it looks too dangerous. You also have a right to know of any hazards that the organization should know in their risk assessment, their hazard assessment, that there might be damages or some special situation that they should alert their volunteers to. You have a right to know this. And finally, you have a right to participate. Organizations, there are certain requirements about when organizations have to have committees or representatives under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it depends how many employees they have. So that's another whole session on occupational health and safety if you want to know a little bit more about that. But generally, think about volunteers. You have rights, and you need to know what they are. And the organizations that are using volunteers, you need to know what the rights of your volunteers are under this legislation. I think we have a resource slide for you next, which you can look at. Oh, sorry, before I have to make a special mention, harassment and violence, as you all know, because you answered the poll, most of you correctly, it is considered a workplace hazard. So you need to make sure your volunteers are protected from harassment and violence, that you have all your policies in place, etc. Very important. So that's all I'm going to say about OHS, but there's lots more to think about as far as volunteers are concerned. And IntegralOrg, one of our toolkits, is available for you. You can download it and you can look at some of the templates we have there and some of the good links we have. So that's the legislation that might give volunteer rights. The next thing I mentioned was about contracts that an organization would enter into with their volunteers. What could a contract contain that a volunteer enters into? Look at all the titles and things that could be in that contract, many, many things. But one thing could be, you could have a section in your contract about, these are your rights as a volunteer. You know, you could put all sorts of things in there, code of rights, things like that. And Erin will talk about some of these things that relate to the relationship between the organization and the volunteers. But you could also have indemnities. And an indemnity is a promise to pay someone for a loss. Generally, that's what it is. So if you felt that you were in some situation as a volunteer that, you know, you would want to be compensated if anything happened to you, or if your property got damaged or something, the contract with the organization could include an indemnity, a promise to pay. And I'll talk a little bit more about indemnities when I get to directors as well. But let's go on to some examples of rights that you could include in a volunteer contract. Well, you might want a right that the volunteer has their role and their description described to them. You might have authorization rights in there. What rights do they have to do anything? What permission do they have to represent themselves? They might want to know about their rights to have orientation to the organization or the place that they're going to do their volunteer work. The training, they might feel they need rights to have some training. They might want to make sure that there's a right, that there's a safe environment and that the organization is complying with the occupational health and safety. They might the right to provide feedback to somebody, a supervisor or some named person. And very important in today's day and age, the right to privacy. You know, they might want that specifically protected in their contract, as it may not be protected elsewhere. So these are basic things that you could put in a volunteer contract, or you could ask for if you're a volunteer and you want these protections for yourself. Because remember, as I said, the rights have to come from somewhere. And if they're not going to come from the law and they're not going to come from the contract, well, where else could they come from? The last thing I think I mentioned was the special role of volunteer directors that need to have a little bit of a discussion here. Because as you know, in Alberta, we have organizations either incorporated under our, you know, the Societies Act or the Companies Act that have boards of directors, and then they have other kinds of people involved in the organization as volunteers too. But the directors have a special role of volunteers. So let's talk a little bit about their duties first. And in Alberta, we have a little bit of a different situation than many other jurisdictions, because our Alberta Societies Act and our Companies Act do not specifically change the common law for duties of directors and officers in an organization. So I always talk a little bit about the differences in our jurisdiction. So all directors at common law had the duty of care and the duty of loyalty to their organization. So the common law indicated that the duty of care basically is to act, you know, with competence and diligence that a reasonable, prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. So I highlight that because the common law puts a focus on the expertise of the individual. So if an accountant is a volunteer director, then they are bringing to the table, according to the common law, the skills and expertise of an accountant. So that's something to consider, because our legislation does not take that away. The duty of loyalty is, pretty straightforward. It deals with things about like conflict of interest, your loyalties to the organization, not from where you come. There's lots of things that directors have duties about at common law. But I'll talk quickly on the next slide about the modern legislation that some of you may be incorporated under, which is the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. And in that statute, they codify the director's duties. And they're listed in the Act, and they talk about the what we call the objective standard of care for directors. So all directors are expected to bring similar skills and expertise to the boardroom table, and not their own skills and expertise. So they're all treated the same. So an accountant would not have a higher standard of care necessarily under this legislation as they might at the common law. This is kind of a confusing area of law, but one that you have to understand when you're talking about duties and rights of volunteers, because directors have these duties, and do they have any rights? That's the next question. Do they have rights? We hope they do. But before we get to that, we're going to do a little skill testing question again. So answer the following scenario questions about director duties. They're kind of long questions, but I'll read them out. So one, the board of directors of a food bank are discussing whether they should enter into a contract with catering company Cater to You to assist with ordering and preparing food for the homeless. One of the directors, Mark, is a shareholder in Cater to You. Does Mark have any duty to disclose his relationship with Cater to You? And then the second one is a board of directors are reviewing financial statements. One of the directors, Beth, is a certified accountant. Does Beth have to meet a higher standard of care than the other directors? Good. Well, I'm going to end the poll, and I'm happy to say all of you pretty well got the answer to number one question, that yes, they do have to disclose their relationship, and there's many other things depending on the legislation they're incorporated under as to what process has to happen there. And secondly, the Beth, the accountant, most of you did understand that it depends. It really does depend whether the subjective standard of care of common law applies to them or the objective standard of care that is in some of the modern legislation applies. So good. Thank you. So duties are one thing, but directors, do they have rights? Well, common law and legislation do provide different duties for directors, but they also have rights. Generally, directors have the rights, and these are volunteer directors as well as other kinds of directors, but directors generally have rights to include getting access to the resources of their corporation or organization to perform their duty as directors. They do have the right to inspect books, records, and documents and property owned by the organization. Why? Because they're the overseers of it, right? That's their responsibility to preserve the assets of the organization. And they have the rights to receive minutes of meeting, vote, and have minutes made of the discussions or the motions and decisions that were made. So that's a real gloss over on directors, but I had to just make sure that you knew that directors as volunteers in nonprofit organizations have different things to think about than volunteers that are like frontline volunteers. So moving along, let's talk a little bit about indemnities, because I know people always ask that. So again, an indemnity is generally It's a legal term. It's generally a contract that promises to pay someone for a loss. So we talked about the volunteer contracts. Well, in the case of directors and officers, you know, they are responsible. They have all these duties. So if something goes wrong and they are sued or something, they want to make sure that they are paid back for their loss. So that's what an indemnity contract is. The effectiveness, of course, of any indemnity contract with an organization does depend on whether the organization has the ability to pay for the loss. So just remember, before we pause on these topics, is that the nonprofit organization is responsible. So you can't pawn off these kinds of losses onto someone else. So you're responsible. Indemnities make you pay for the loss if a director or a volunteer is responsible for the loss. But if you don't have the money, where else can you get it? So I have a little note of about insurance on the next slide. Just so you know that, generally, if someone is indemnifying someone, you want to make sure that you have the insurance to back it up. So a director's assets are usually at risk if the organization cannot cover the loss for various things. So an organization considers insurance, which is a form of indemnity to cover legal costs and claims against directors and officers. You should discuss your insurance needs with a knowledgeable broker or agent if you're an organization. And if you're a director or someone who's about to volunteer for an organization, you probably want to ask some questions about insurance coverage. What does the organization have? So that's a long-winded discussion about contractual things. The next place you would find rights is, and this is a resource slide that we'll flip because it talks about places you can go to look at risk management for directors, good resources. But let's talk a little bit about where else you can see. You could see rights given to volunteers in an organization's policies. And this is probably where most of you would look, or where organizations would get down to listing what you want your volunteers to do and what their rights are. And Erin will be talking about that, but we have some tools here that are coming right out of the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement that audit you about your infrastructure for volunteer involvement in your documents to see if you have these frameworks. So there's great checklists in that resource. So please look at it. And I know Erin's familiar with it. So Erin, what kinds of things should you put in your policies, your contracts for your volunteers? Let's hear about the good stuff here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Yeah, so we're going to start with just talking about job descriptions. So for everyone who's listening, who is a volunteer manager or a volunteer specialist, or you're involved or responsible for job descriptions for volunteers, we do have a previous webinar on our resources page called Developing Volunteer Positions, which will cover everything that we're about to talk about. But for everyone here who is a volunteer or a board member, I myself am a volunteer too. These are things that you can look out for when you are signing up for a volunteer position. Things that should be included in a job description, for example. So the first thing you're going to want to look for is any policies or training that you need to read or you need to complete. So policies will outline how the organization functions, as well as any procedures for you to know about so that you can perform your duties well. And you can also look for steps to screening that you may be expected to complete. And so we understand too that there are certain steps that not everyone is comfortable with completing. So before you start a volunteer role, that's something that you can ask about or look for to make sure that that screening process is something that you are able to walk through. So it might be worthwhile to see that, to look for that even before you reach out to an organization if they have it on their website. Also, knowing who you are expected to report to is going to be a very good piece of information for you to have as well, especially knowing who the health and safety representative is, just in case you notice something that you feel is unsafe to complete in your role. And so if you're looking for a potential reference to use for other job searches, other volunteer roles that you're interested in, Also knowing how to contact your supervisor, who your supervisor is also going to be a helpful piece of information. So this is also the person who can provide feedback on your work and on your role for you. And that can help you reach your personal goals if you're hoping to develop a certain skill. But sometimes job descriptions or other policies will state how often you'll need to report to your supervisor and who that is, or if there's any reports that you'll need to write out and hand in, how often. So you should be looking for that in the policies as well, so that you can perform that task. If this is unclear in the policies or in the job description, you can always ask the volunteer coordinator or your manager just on how that process of seeking feedback and communication works and how often you're expected to report or ask for feedback and what that looks like. And also knowing what you are expected to do is a big one. So I would hope that the tasks you're expected to complete in your volunteer role are ones that you'll enjoy doing, or ones that will help you to develop certain skills that you're hoping to grow in. But knowing your tasks and expected duties is very important because it does outline your scope of duties, which Yvonne mentioned earlier. So to explain what is a scope of duties, what does that even look like? It's going to talk about what needs to be done, but also what tasks you're protected while doing. It can also be described as a scope of work or responsibilities or tasks or a description of the role. So that's why we're looking and asking for a job description when we're looking for organizations to get involved with, or perhaps from your organization that you're involved with currently. And so like Yvonne mentioned earlier as well, the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Freedom to Care Act does offer protection for volunteers, but of course we need to know what we're doing and we need to understand the boundaries that we're protected within. So the scope of duties should be defined within the job description that you're given. And sometimes volunteer position descriptions are posted online and sometimes they're just internal documents, but it's something that you can always ask for if an organization does have a document to provide for you. But in the end, you should be familiar with the tasks you're expected to do and will be doing so that you know when you're protected. So the reason why you need to know your scope of duties, again, it helps set a boundary of what's expected of you, and it can help clear up any confusion, and it can also help volunteers and organizations work better together to achieve that mission and the vision that the organization has set out to fulfill. So also make sure that you know what those expected tasks are and work within those, because again, you may not be covered if you act outside of your scope of duties. So working within your scope of duties provides protection for you, as well as ensuring the safety of the clients and the community members that the organization serves and supports. So we'll move on to our next part, which is this concept of interviewing the organization. So you might get interviewed as a volunteer by the organization, but you may also be thinking, how am I supposed to take action to ensure that the volunteer role is a good fit for me when I'm unclear of what my scope of duties are or who I'm supposed to report to, and if the volunteer role is even going to be a good fit for me? So when volunteer managers, volunteer coordinators are recruiting for volunteers, what they're looking for is a good fit for the role. But you as a volunteer can also look to see if the organization is going to be a good fit for you and where you're at. So some of the questions that you can ask to interview the organization back could be just starting to ask with what's being done with your information. So again, looking into some of those, how your information is being kept private or protected. For example, you could ask if they keep your files locked and in secure locations, where that might be, or if they use digital copies, who has access to them? Are they going to be deleted or destroyed after a certain time period? And who has access to the information? Are there other staff members or organization members who have access to your personal information? So that's one place you can start. You can also ask if they give references. So please note that not all organizations do offer references just because of organizational policies. So if you're eventually looking to apply for a job or another volunteer role that may require a reference and you're hoping to build up your references list, just ask the organization if that's a possibility for them to do for you. Know who the occupational health and safety rep is so that you can direct your safety concerns to them. So nonprofits are required to have a health and safety rep, and in some larger organizations, a whole committee. So in the event that you aren't comfortable with fulfilling a certain task, it will be helpful to know who you can reach out to, and then procedures on how to reach out to them. The next part of interviewing the organization, as we're talking about it, is just asking if any skills will be developed in the role. So if you're looking to develop certain skills, if you want to add to your resume or just help you meet your personal goals, you can ask the organization what that might look like in the volunteer role. So you can also ask if there is room to improve certain skills, even if they aren't included in the job description. And sometimes organizations may be willing to help train or mentor you to grow in certain skills, to grow into a certain role, or to develop skills that perhaps aren't a part of the job description. And that's the time where you can collectively create this volunteer role. So if there's a skill set that you don't necessarily meet for the role, you can always ask if this is something that the organization will be willing to support you in learning. And you can also explain why you want to learn that skill too, if it's to apply for a certain job, but we'll get to more of that in a second. Ask for clarification if needed in anything, if it requires you to do a certain task that you're not 100% sure on, or who you're supposed to report to, or any other part of the role, you can always ask. So if you're unsure what you'll be doing, that's a very important time to ask so that you know when you're protected by legislation and acting within your scope of duties. But especially when we're new to organizations, we don't know all the ins and outs. So it's good to know who you can ask and that you can ask for clarification when needed. Again, to better support you in your role, and then to support the community that is affected by the organization and the programming. And then I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, communicating your goals. So whether that's to move into a certain job or to move into another volunteer role that you're hoping to meet the requirements for one day, it's totally okay if you're volunteering towards a certain goal in your life, even if it is for self-fulfillment as well, or to serve a certain population in your community. We all know that you're passionate people who care about your communities, and we also know that you have goals that you want to achieve, and we want you to be empowered in your volunteer roles so that you can accomplish your goals. And one way to do that is to communicate with organizations so that you can collaboratively with the organization achieve those goals that you have set out for yourself. So in the next slide, part of starting a volunteer role means that it will also come to an end, and there's nothing wrong with having your time with an organization close. But there's some certain things that you might want to keep an eye out for when you start a role. Before you even think about perhaps transitioning out of a certain volunteer role, it might just be something you want to look at as soon as you get involved with an organization. So when your volunteer role is finishing up for whatever reason, are there any specific procedures for leaving that you'll need to be aware of? And so that's something, again, you can look and ask about right away. But for example, does the organization require 2 weeks of notice? Are there any supplies that you need to hand in? Is there like an exit interview or phone call that's expected? And these are questions that, again, you can reach out to your supervisor to ask about. And of course, you'll also need to notify your supervisor or volunteer manager. There may also be clients or program participants that you might want to notify as well. Just look into any policies on what that might look like for your organization. And also asking who you can leave feedback for, and if there's any specific process surrounding providing feedback for the organization. Some organizations, will have procedures. Sometimes they might be more informal ways to collect feedback. Perhaps it's like a phone call or a coffee, but there's also a possibility it might be a survey. But part of what we're sharing here at Volunteer Alberta is that volunteering requires this relationship. So having this kind of two-way street between an organization and a volunteer to gain feedback from each other can help reflect all of the perspectives that are involved in volunteer programming in order to continue providing that safe and welcoming programming for the community, which does include the volunteer program as well. A special note is that if you are leaving from a director or officer role, you do need to make sure that your resignation is accepted, but you also have to notify Service Alberta within 15 days. Otherwise, your name will remain on that list. In our last slide, so sometimes there will be concerns that can't be solved internally. So there are resources that you can access. So you can visit the Occupational Health and Safety Act website. That's also where you can learn more about the Act. And there you will also find an online form that you can submit complaints through, as well as their contact information if you want to call them. If there is a concern with fair treatment, then you can also reach out to the Ombudsman office to submit a complaint. The Ombudsman protects this right of protection and fair treatment in public services by promoting standards of fairness and has the authority to make recommendations if an investigation reveals unfairness. So they may be able to point you in the right direction of another resource that they're aware of too. So for more information, you can also visit their website. And you can also reach out to the Alberta Human Rights Commission website if you have a complaint to submit. So for everyone who was registered for this webinar today, I will be sending out the links for all of these websites so that you can access them. So keep an eye out for that email. So for the volunteer screening program, if you're interested in learning more, you are more than welcome to visit our website. Again, we do offer a fee waiver for the vulnerable sector check if that sounds like something that your organization could benefit from. And the screening development grants, we will open up later this year in the summertime. And this was, if we go to the next slide, this was the first installment in our 3-part webinar series on equity and inclusion in volunteer screening. So thank you everyone for joining us. Our next webinar is on February 27th, and it is a goals-based approach to volunteer screening and how to nourish relationships and trust in volunteer programming. So I noticed in the pre-survey, thank you to everyone who filled that out, that there were some questions on how we can make screening flexible for different volunteer roles and different needs in the community. This would be the one for you, as we're going to go through how to make a flexible approach that is unique to your volunteers' needs, but also the community that you're working with. So I'd encourage you to come. All of these webinars are free. And then the last one in the series is engaging newcomers, welcoming newcomers to participate in volunteerism, where we will learn more about what inspires newcomers to volunteer, unique motivations, as well, and how organizations can craft opportunities that align with their goals to volunteer. So all webinars, same time, 11 a.m. to 12:15 on February 27th and March 19th, and I will send the registration links in the follow-up email as well. And then our last slide here, you are more than welcome to get in contact with us. The volunteer screening program does offer free coaching to nonprofits in Alberta if you're interested in learning more about volunteer screening. And then you can also continue the conversation with us today. If you'd like to reach out to us or our friends over at IntegralOrg if you have any questions. And you can also access our resources from the Volunteer Alberta resource library through the website as well. So all registered participants will be receiving this presentation recording and all mentioned resources, and there will also be a follow-up survey. Thank you again to everyone who filled out the pre-survey. There will be a follow-up one that we'd so appreciate if you fill out so that we can continue offering effective and timely webinars to nonprofits. So we'll just go to the last slide. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording in a couple seconds here. If you need to go, thank you so much for joining us. And we will move to our question and answer time very shortly. So just give me a sec and thank you if you are heading out now.